天天在一起，天天用心听，听见台北的声音。FM 93.1，幸福永远属于你。
公民总主笔，
方恩格时间。
谁当家？
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 你当家？
谁当家？
谁当家？谁当家？
谁当家？我当家。你当家？我当家。
我当家。
到底谁当家？你来当家。Residence Messenger on Taipei Broadcasting Station. I'm your host, Ross Darrell-Feingold. Today, our very special guest is Dr. Harry Wu Yirei from National Cheng Kung University. Dr. Wu, or Harry, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you, Ross, for inviting me.
Your field is, and correct me if I'm wrong, but your field of research and expertise is it's the history of medicine and science.
That's right.
Yeah, and that's such a fascinating field because we know historians. We sometimes read books by historians, but we always think about it like about wars and political stuff. And we know scientists, right? Because they're always on TV or in the movies, and we see their scientific achievements. But we rarely focus on the history of scientific research or the history of the medical profession and providing medical care. So I'm looking forward to a very fascinating talk. But before we talk about your career in research and as a historian of medicine and science, tell us a bit about yourself. Where did you grow up?
Okay, actually, I was born in Taiwan. I grew up in Taiwan, in the middle of Taiwan, Zhanghua, right. And then I studied also university in the middle part of Taiwan, which was in Taichung. And then I worked a little bit in Taipei before moving abroad to do my further studies.
Yeah, what were your academic or leisure interests as a child? Were you always interested in sciences?
I would rather say that I was a programmed child to become a doctor, right? Because I'm from a medical family, right? But actually, I was better at, for example, like literature or language, right? So I was always looking for opportunities to do something else.
Well, I'm going to ask you a tough question because obviously I'm not from Taiwan, but the doctors that I've gotten to know or friends whose parents are doctors, it seems very common. Again, this is only anecdotally, people telling me their family stories, but it seems common to me in Taiwan that there are doctor families.
That's right.
Where dad or mom or uncle or aunt, grandma, there's just a lot of medical doctors in the family. Why is that? From a historian's perspective.
Yeah, from a historian's perspective. I mean, during the Japanese colonial period, and also after the Second World War, I mean, being a doctor or a lawyer, this is something for you to get a chance to move upward, right? And then to stay safe. Well, actually, post-war Taiwan was politically not very stable, and this is something that you can, in Chinese, people say 安身立命. That means you can stay sound, you can pursue your career, you can accumulate money, and then you can do whatever you want.
But if we go back to that period, say 80, 90, 100 years ago in Taiwan, could somebody from a very modest family, a farmer's family, but a very brilliant child, get into the medical school? Or did it really, it was a small group of people who were already well-to-do and could afford to tutor their children and get into good primary or secondary school and then get into the medical faculty?
Well, I would say that this phenomenon started in 1920s, as early in the early 1920s, when Japanese colonized Taiwan, they wanted to develop the education, but what they did not expect is that people started to realize that they can study hard and then they can pursue their intellect, and then they become some kind of elites in the society, right? So it started quite earlier.
What did you major in university?
Medicine.
Okay, the same as people who go on to become doctors.
That's right, yes.
And how far did you go with that before you knew in your heart that you wanted to do something in more research, something that kind of mixes liberal arts as well, instead of actually being a bedside doctor.
Yeah, I practiced very briefly, only for 1 year in Taipei, and then I decided to. Actually, that was a kind of a thought out of the blue that I thought I wanted to study psychoanalysis for 1 year first, and then see what I can do after using out of my money, right? So and then I got the opportunity to study history of medicine, and I never went back.
Never went back. So you obtained a PhD at Oxford, from where you were a very honored student, the Clifford Norton student in the history of science at Queen's College. First, tell us what that is. What is the Clifford Norton student in the history of science?
Okay, that was I was looking for the origin of that scholarship as well, and then I realized that it was a diplomat, a British diplomat, and then actually the scholarship was created in 1960s when there was a debate about two cultures, the cultures of science and culture of arts, and then. The debate of that kind of two cultures became very popular in 1960s, and then the college, I think, at some point, I didn't know in which year, that it designed this scholarship to promote a graduate student to become a member of the so-called the high table, to be able to dine with all sorts, all disciplinary scholars on the table, right? And so it continued to this day.
Why Oxford? Are they particularly known for this field of research and publications about the history of science compared to universities elsewhere in Europe or the United States?
I guess that was a general trend. It's not only in Oxford. Since 1960s and 70s that this became a very popular topic. Right.
What was your thesis topic for your PhD?
I was looking at psychological trauma as a diagnosis. It got transformed from a very loose and very vague concept into an actual diagnosis in psychiatry, and how it could be applied in different cultures. Right.
So which cultures did you write about?
Taiwan.
Your thesis was about Taiwan.
Yeah.
Was it difficult to access historical documents and records for that topic?
Well, I need to make use of different sorts of documents, and also I need to do some interviews, right? And it's not difficult, right? But
actually, they keep all the old records over at some of the Taiwan's biggest hospitals.
I guess it's not really. Well, I got lucky that I discovered a set of archival materials that are preserved by a doctor who practiced in National Taiwan University, and then after he died, he donated all the patient records to the institution Academia Sinica. So in part of my thesis, I used that set of archive.
What was something new that you kind of brought out in your thesis, or a contribution to this field that was learned or discovered for the first time via your thesis? You know what,
I'm not that confident about my thesis, because that was for me, I'm not really satisfied with that. But it took me about 8 years to rewrite, to ask different questions, and to rewrite a book. And it got published this year, and there was only one chapter that is overlapping my current publication in my thesis, right? And yeah, so you're interested in in the book I just published?
Yeah, we will talk about that a little later. But let's talk a little bit about some of your teaching experience. You taught at Nanyang Technological University.
That's right.
in Singapore. What courses did you teach there?
I taught a survey course of history of science, right? So that was from medieval period to modern days, right? And also I designed a course myself. It was the Cultures of Madness, which I kept teaching for the past several years. And then, I really loved that course, and I'm still looking for opportunities to teach this in Taiwan. Right?
Tell us a bit about the academic environment in Singapore, because sometimes it's criticized for you have to stay in a lane outside of, say, the pure sciences, which they very much encourage. Right. But anything that's more in the liberal arts, sometimes you got to be a little careful. They have some sensitivities there. Did that occur in your field?
There is always this controversy And in Singapore, among scholars, people know about there's a term called the OB line, which is
advanced markers.
That's right, that marker. And then people will there will be some self-censorship, right? If you really touch upon some controversial issues, but it actually never occurred to me when I was there, right? And I left Singapore because there was a professor, late professor, who invited me very wholeheartedly, right, for me to go back to Hong Kong and teach, right?
And tell us a bit about your experience teaching in Hong Kong. What courses did you teach there?
Right, I led a program called Medical Humanities at the Li Ka-shing Faculty of Medicine, which is part of the University of Hong Kong. And that was the unit was not established by myself, but actually a few years ago, a group of visionary physicians, they realized that we need to, apart from science itself, very, very hard science, there is something lacking. There is so-called the hidden curriculum that students need to learn about, which is the soft skills and all the critical and reflective and critical thinking that are related to arts and social sciences, and that kind of things should be implemented in the official medical curriculum. And so I was invited to lead that program.
And give us a numerical understanding if they had, say, previously zero exposure to this, or maybe it was 2 credit hours during their whole medical education. Where would the advocates, or where did the advocates for more of this kind of coursework for the students, where would they like it to be as part of the overall medical education? You measure it by hours or some other metric, but how much exposure would the advocates want it to be?
By hours. I think in the first year that we designed the whole program for the exposure of 30-something hours.
It sounds like a lot.
That's but actually it got reduced over time. When they became clinical, we got little room to implement this.
And what did the opponents say? But tell me if I'm wrong, but I'm going to assume there was probably some traditional doctors who said, well, we don't need too much of this. We really need to do the typical traditional education, and this is a little too funky. We don't need that much.
The opinions are very dichotomized. Right? Some do like it, some do not.
But what do the opponents say? What's their reason for saying, well, we don't know, we need to do, like I said before, the bedside stuff, and we don't need this kind of theoretical.
They will say that if you really want to understand arts, actually, or humanities, it's learning by doing, right? And then so. And for example, like we believe that in this kind of education, that students can be influenced. For example, they need to develop empathy, right? And can this be really taught?
What's the answer?
Right. Well, my answer is that we can influence students in different ways, but then whether or not this can be measured, they want to see outcomes. I mean, modern medical education, they always want to see outcomes. And then this is unmeasurable. So for some educators, they don't think this is practical. They can't see the numbers. That's why. And
how do you win those arguments when you're, say, in a faculty senate, or you're with the deans and you're discussing their curriculum?
I never win. But this is in the medical council, they wanted us to provide this education. So the position is always will be there, but I never win.
So it's always a downward pressure on the number of hours that the students will have. How about the students? How do they feel about being required as medical students to take courses in this area?
This is very difficult questions. I mean, students in Hong Kong, especially medical students, they are very practical, pragmatic.
I think that's the reputation of Hong Kong people generally. Can I say that on the radio?
All right. Okay. And then actually they mostly, some of them are very curious students, and I really love them. And everyone, for example, out of 200 and something students, if a year there are 3 to 5 students who are very curious and they want to study, they want to form some study group with me, I will be very happy. But most students are very strategic, right? So they want scores, they want good grades.
And so the last thing they want is to get a bad grade in a course that's not really the actual kind of medical.
So this is very embarrassing. So we always have to pull them out. Right?
Well, hopefully you didn't have to fail anyone.
We did fail some people, but actually that's very few occasions.
did you teach these classes in English or in Cantonese when you're in Hong Kong?
Right, in English.
Everything's in English.
Right. Yeah, but actually, when we spend time with students, we speak in Cantonese.
Mm-hmm,
right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's been so much change in Hong Kong, to put it diplomatically, over the past few years, and your time there overlapped with some of that. Did it come into the medical classroom as well? Some of those issues that were going on outside in the protests.
Yeah, there are some ethical debates. Students, they want to know about, but we don't have the room to discuss it. Mm-hmm. So I use extracurriculum time to study what is policing with students, and then they were asking me, okay, if they went out for protest and then they provide first aid to those protesters, and who actually, for example, cast bricks or Molotov cocktails,
gas bombs,
to the police. So are they doing the right thing? So we spent some time discussing over these issues, mm-hmm. and unfortunately, after some time, campuses in Hong Kong got closed down, mm-hmm. because of some incidents, and then we got no more opportunities to do mm-hmm. this.
What was the view? I know this could be a bit sensitive, but were there students who, although they're students, did they want to go out and volunteer to provide medical care to protesters? What was the view of the people above you at the school? Did they have no opinion? Did they kind of discourage students from using their medical skills to provide first aid?
Most of us stays silent, actually, right? Mm-hmm. It's a very sensitive topic in the institutions. You don't want to lose your job. Right?
I mean, I can understand where students that would want to provide their skills if they supported that side, right? They would feel compelled. What persuaded you to return to Taiwan?
Well, actually, institutions in Taiwan are very generous. They kept inviting me back, and then encouraging me to apply for the open positions here. And then also, I got worried that if I stayed too long in Hong Kong, will I become numb, or become insensitive to all the unjust that is currently happening there, right? So I told myself, okay, perhaps this is the time for me to come back, mm-hmm. right?
如有长照服务需求、长照特别扣除额问题，请拨打1966长照专线，5分钟内通话免付费。一通电话让长期照顾管理专员协助申请长期照顾服务及解答长期照顾特别扣除额相关问题。以上内容由台北市政府卫生局提供。
爸爸应酬不开车，黄色嘟嘟安全多，应酬喝酒不过量，安全回家最上道。爸爸要平安回家哦。
喝酒不开车，开车不喝酒哦。让我们一起尊重生命，拥抱亲情。
亲爱的民众，提醒您定期清除排油烟机内部油垢。烹煮食物时，切忌分心做其他事情，并注意人离火熄。且厨房附近应设置灭火器，操作时保持适当距离。当厨房火灾时，严禁以水灭火。油锅起火也千万不要移动油锅，以免翻覆造成火势扩大延烧。以上内容由台北市政府消防局提供。
亲爱的朋友，您还在吸烟吗？快拿着健保卡到戒烟门诊，或拨打戒烟专线0800636363。提醒您，最近兴起的电子烟、加热烟，因为没有浓浓的烟臭味，就被认为无害。其实已经证实，新兴烟品都有二手烟及三手烟的危害，甚至还有爆炸的风险。我是义工蔡依林，所有烟品都 get out。我拒烟，我骄傲。
2021台北灯节以七彩八宝新世界为主题，在12月17号到26号在万华艋舺登场，线上加线下精彩节目不间断，有史上第一个会跳舞的牛神主灯，还有歌手伍佰、魏如萱、娄俊硕、董事长乐团魏佳莹、江蕙怡陪你开翻天。以上内容由台北市政府观光传播局提供。
教育部提醒大家，开学防疫不松懈，请家长每日量孩子体温，如有发烧请就医，并在家休息。上课时要全程佩戴口罩，采固定座位、固定成员。使用空调时保持通风良好，用餐时采个人套餐，使用隔板或维持社交距离，不并桌、不交谈。校园防疫不松懈，安心学习有保障。以上广告由教育部提供。
大家好，我是奥运举重国手郭幸存。举重不是硬碰硬，而是找对方法去面对它，就跟防疫一样。面对疫情，我们可以扎稳基本功，勤洗手、戴口罩，维持社交距离。面对未知，我们可以谨慎以对，主动查证讯息，避免恐慌。让我们团结抗疫，一起为台湾拿下防疫金牌。台湾加油！
有政府，请安心。以上广告由行政院与机关署提供。
谁当家？
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 你当家？
谁当家？
谁当家？谁当家？
谁当家？我当家。你当家？我当家。
我当家。
到底谁当家？你来当家。
Welcome back to Residence Messenger on Taipei Broadcasting Station. Our guest today is Dr. Harry Wu from National Cheng Kung University, an expert on the history of medicine and science. Dr. Wu, let's discuss your current research and your new book. You're very focused, you mentioned earlier, transnational histories of mental health in your book, Mad by the Millions, Mental Disorders in the Early Years of the World Health Organization. First, just so the audience is clear, in the title, Mad by the Millions, Mental Disorders in the Early Years of the WHO, what do you mean by mental disorders? In layman's terms, what disorders are we talking about?
Well, mental disorders, actually, basically in this book, I talk about psychiatric diagnosis, right? And especially I looked at the diagnosis of schizophrenia and how did the experts in the WHO understand that diagnosis by collecting evidence in different countries. Right?
Why was this topic timely to research and write about in the last couple of years when you were doing the work to publish or to do the manuscript and finish the book?
Right. Okay, over time, the people, in psychiatric sciences kept asking, is there a universality in terms of mental suffering? Do we as human beings share the same category or classification of mental disorders? And then, so in this book is actually, it's a history of science book. So it's about how knowledge making occurs in institutions that claims to be international, right?
We often think of the WHO as focused on things like COVID-19 and pandemics. What role does the WHO play in something like treatment of mental disorders?
Right. Actually, they did some health promotion videos encouraging, for example, like home-based brief psychological support, right, in different nations. And actually, if it got something to do with my book. This is about disease classification, and what this classification, ICD International Classification of Diseases, is important is that it provides foundation for the WHO to allocate resources, right? And then WHO is a money mover, right? And so, so if you want to provide treatment, first of all, you need to understand how people suffer, and what you need is diagnosis.
Going back over the decades since the establishment of the WHO, what did your book reveal about the WHO's history within the mental disorder space?
Right. So as a historian of science, we see science doing is a kind of cultural or social process, right? So in order to understand something that the WHO, they need to come across a kind of research method, and they wanted to understand whether or not psychiatric disorders, for example, like schizophrenia, look alike. So they need to collect different patients, observe them, interview them, and then in different countries, and using all, for example, use modern technologies, up-to-date technologies, to understand whether or not this is true, right? So basically, this is my book, and it reveals that actually the WHO did not operate only in one world; it operates in many different worlds, especially also in the Cold War, and then so there were a lot of political debates within the program, and also. The consequences is that, okay, they proved that a universal psychiatric classification is useful. It provides a golden standard for underdeveloped countries. But there are limitations as well, because they cannot really account for mental sufferings in many other different cultures.
What was the reaction to the book so far from experts in the field? And I'm thinking, when I say experts, I'm thinking more the actual practitioners of psychiatry, or people who do treat mental disorders.
Right. I got more audience in the field of history than in medicine, but I'm quite excited that a few medical institutions have already invited me to give a talk there, and then I got some positive book reviews in some journals. But I think I hope that this book can reach out to more clinicians.
What about the WHO itself? Anyone? We know how they feel about Taiwan. We don't have to talk about that. But anyone from the WHO interact with you?
Yeah, actually, there is a Center for the History of Global Health in York University in the UK, and they are inviting me to do something in January next year.
Correct me if I'm wrong, though. Even though the book is looking at the history and the WHO's involvement in this issue, it is meant to be helpful going forward, correct? And help the WHO do a better job on mental disorders? Is it to help the WHO improve its processes, improve what it does internally, to ensure that countries around the world do provide better outcomes?
Yeah, that's what WHO is wanting, right?
Are you optimistic they're going to take up?
I can't say that I'm too optimistic, right? What the WHO is, WHO is constantly changing. It's not only an institution or only one organization. Now it's facing a lot of challenges. For example, that it needs partnership, right? So and also there are too many political obstacles to overcome. And WHO, since the past, since 70 years ago, it has grown to become a huge bureaucracy. And so it's very interesting that sometimes people are discussing matters in the regional offices, and their voices are not heard in the headquarters. And so these are some obstacles it's currently facing.
Yeah, their voices aren't heard. The people who say in the regional offices aren't maybe not heard in the headquarters. Is that because of the bureaucracy, or is that because this issue, especially with COVID, is not considered a WHO priority?
Well, I guess bureaucracy is something that WHO itself it has known about itself, right? And so that's why it kept changing its own strategies, right? Yeah, very difficult to answer this question, I guess. Right?
But I mean, for example, people at the WHO, I'll just ask you very frankly, do they say, we have a limited amount of resources, putting aside the politics and the bureaucracy, and we have $1, we want to spend most of that, whether it's on COVID now or malaria or public sanitation and things like that, and do they feel that mental health is truly part of their mission?
Yeah. I mean, mental health has been on the emphasis since, I guess, about 5 years ago. And then, it's a huge issue. I mean, especially they put a lot of money in depression. Right?
Anything relevant from your research to how the WHO has approached COVID-19? Or are the issues so different and the histories are so different and COVID-19 is still developing that it's hard to find any commonalities there?
Okay. So actually, I mainly look at mental health, and my recent research does not really cover WHO that much. But I look at one thing, is that in some research I'm asking, now people do suffer during COVID-19, but actually for very advanced now in Taiwan, psychiatric sciences are so advanced, but it's quite difficult for psychiatrists or psychologists to account for, to realize what people are suffering, and by only look at mental symptoms or disorders or diagnosis, because people do suffer, and not only in the way that it can be manifested as disorders as such, right?
What are some courses you're teaching now or in the upcoming semesters here in Taiwan?
Right. I'm developing something called the illness narratives, but I practice this by looking at using theater. I used to teach documentary theater to people from different disciplinary students, and because now we are in Taiwan that long-term chronic care is such a topic, it's very popular. And I want to develop more creative ways for people to understand what caring, long-term care is like. So I train students to interview real carers, and then they will themselves act out their in-depth interviews. And so through this, they can learn really or reflect on what caring is all about.
So when the students do the interviews, who are they interviewing? Are they interviewing what in English we might call like a home health care attendant, or are they interviewing nurses, doctors?
Yeah, so caring is a very interesting thing, right? You can say it's if it happens in the hospital, these carers are doctors, nurses, social workers, or paramedic workers. But actually caring, this term can be very, very broadly defined. So what I want to do is to train students to look at things from different perspectives. So you need different voices from different perspectives, right? So actually in the hospital, a janitor is also part of the caring system, right? So all these voices need to be heard, and so I encourage students to approach all of them.
Broadly speaking, and even though you've only been back in Taiwan for a short period of time, have you observed some shortcomings in how Taiwan trains its doctors?
Actually, this is a very difficult question. And I mean in Taiwan, I guess the medical education, the level and the standard is very high. This is something that I'm very happy about. But actually, doctors in Taiwan also need to open up themselves more to collaborate with other disciplinary people. And this because, for example, like I got some fellowship several years ago in Canada, in Montreal, and then I found that psychiatry as a graduate course, they enroll all kinds of people, not only physicians, but also social workers, nurses, even magicians, right? So these medical sciences do not really belong to one kind of profession. I mean, we need more flexible. We need to be more flexible, I think.
You're talking about the doctors of Taiwan need to be more flexible.
That's right, yeah. But I guess people are already doing that. Right?
I'm going to ask you a really tough question. Do you also interact with students who are studying traditional medicine, or your focus is mostly on Western medical
Yeah, my
students.
focus more focusing on Western medicine, right? But actually, in history of science, we do look at traditional medicine, right?
You're the co-editor of the Journal of Social History of Medicine, and you're on the board of the Taiwanese Journal for Study of Science, Technology, and Medicine. Tell us what these two publications cover.
Right. A social history of medicine is a journal that has been there for 50 years, more than 50 years, and then since it was part of the Society for the Social History of Medicine, right? And then so what they wanted is more non-Western inputs. So I guess I became on the board because of that. And then for the Taiwan, there are two. Actually, I'm on the board of two STS journals in Taiwan, and then they want some more international visibility, right? And I guess yeah, I'm happy to be on the board so that I can connect people in Taiwan with some foreign colleagues, right?
What is some of the content in the Taiwan publications? What are the scholars who publish? What are they writing about? Share with us some examples.
Oh, wow, there are a lot. It's very broad. I mean, this Taiwan Journal of Science, Technology, and Medicine used to be a history of science, philosophy of science journal, and then it became a journal as what it looks like today, because now STS has become, well, what I say, STS is Science, Technology, and Society, or you can say Science and Technology Studies. So any technology, scientific topics that is related to issues in the society will be covered in our field. And for example, like technological controversies, for example, like in the previous years, the controversy of RCA, the Radio Corporation America, it heavily polluted a place in Taoyuan, and then
usually people think of that as like a legal issue, right? Did they break the law by polluting? Do they owe compensation to the workers?
Right, but in this field, people ask how much evidence can really can be taken as evidence to say that okay, this exposure to toxicity is pathological. Right, so we look at the controversy of how evidence about how evidence is made, right? And then so, as I said, so in this field we see the science or knowledge making as a social or cultural process, right? So we detailedly we look at this process.
Right? What about things that are kind of in the news a lot at present, like AI and its role of society? Is that also something that is covered by the
that's right.
journal?
Yeah, people now ask about if you are driving an AI car and then you got involved in a car accident, there is a car accident, then whose responsibility is that? Is that human beings or the machine's responsibility? So all these controversies are very interesting. Yeah.
You mentioned earlier your thesis and updating it subsequently, and one of your publications was a chartered epidemic of trauma, case notes at the psychiatric department of the National Taiwan University Hospital from 1946 to 1953. This just sounds so fascinating that you were able to access records and do some research about patients and the care they received. What did you learn through that research?
Right. This is this is quite interesting. That is in these documents you see how people. I mean, these patients, they become real people, right? You can see the content. A lot of these patients came from, for example, from the mainland after 1945 and 49. Yeah, 49 to 49, and then they suffered from a lot of things. They witnessed the civil war in China, and then they also witnessed the very political unrest in Taiwan, and they got mentally suffered. And then all these are documented in the patient records, and then doctors are finding the right language to describe their suffering. And then some of them, doctors gave them the name of the traumatic neurosis, these kind of things, but they can never accurately actually account for what they are suffering from. And then, but you see all these doctors are, what they are doing on these patients are simply very humanitarian. They want to help them. And so all these documents, we are lucky to acquire them. And then, they document all these very, very precious history.
You mentioned that a lot of the patients had witnessed war, political change, and may have caused some mental disorder. But in that period, who actually could access medical care? I mean, there was no national health insurance at the time. Did the hospital take anyone who walked in off the street, or did it require some kind? Did you have to be wealthy to access medical care? How did it work?
You need to be relatively more well off to be able to see a doctor, of course, right?
But I mean, some of these patients, they must have come to the attention or be transported to the hospital because they had some kind of episode in public, for example.
That's a different category. I mean, for people who walk in, who realize that they are psychiatrically, maybe they suffer from some mental, some distress, and they want to see a doctor, they need to be rich enough. Secondly, their language capacity perhaps is a little bit better than other people. And then, so for most for the general public, I guess during that period they are relatively more silent. They don't know how to express themselves, and then doctors they got no ways to help them as well. Right?
There couldn't have been many doctors at the time with specialized training in this type of treatment in Taiwan.
Only very, very handful.
And how did they treat the patients? There wasn't many types of medication available back then either.
No, right. There were only some. During that period, there was only some anxiolytics. That means, for example, like Xanax, that kind of thing, treating anxiety, that kind of medication only available, right? Did
the research or the records, how far did they go with a particular patient? I mean, was there a happy outcome? I mean, was there a record where a doctor treated somebody over an extended period of time and was able to help the patient and like that's why I say a happy, positive outcome?
Unfortunately, that these documents did not really reveal much about how patient's outcome was like, and then what the detail about psychiatric admission was like, because the records are unavailable apart from the basic demographic data, right? But in these patient records, I found something really interesting. I actually published another paper about how really this is a very sensitive. Did actually psychiatrists collaborated with the government to interrogate political prisoners, right? And then what I found was, of course, it did happen, right? But actually, we shouldn't say that these psychiatrists were baddies, right? Because it was actually the system that we need to examine, that we need to look at the oppressive system was like.
Were those psychiatrists, did they volunteer to work with those government agencies, or were they kind of forced into doing this?
Mostly are forced. Most of them, people are forced to do things. Right?
Yeah, because we think about, like say the American CIA, just to use an example, or their foreign equivalents, they have all sorts of disciplines, including psychiatrists working for them.
Yeah, actually, people work for CIA. For example, there are some notable psychiatrists in the U.S. They actually they received funding from CIA, but actually they didn't realize it. Right.
We talked a little bit earlier about medical education in Taiwan, but I'm curious about your own experience as a patient when you go to the doctor in Taiwan, and with the knowledge that you have. Do you find yourself saying to quietly whispering to yourself like, "Oh, I wish the doctor didn't talk to the patient that way," or something like that?
So I will look for doctors I trust, and the only thing I do is to trust them.
Of course, everyone should go to a doctor.
Right, and the trust is very important. As long as I trust them, I got better.
Do you hear from people in Taiwan that they trust their doctors, or do you hear just anecdotally from your friends and family? well, first you say your family's doctor, so I guess everyone you trust your family. But do generally in Taiwan people trust the doctors?
In general, I think people in Taiwan trust their doctors more.
Right. One thing I found interesting talking with my Taiwan friends is because I come from America, and typically in America we have the family doctor, kind of like that first line. Whenever you have a little problem, a cold or an ache or a pain, you go to like an internist, a generalist, and you don't necessarily go to a specialist. And often, even though nowadays it could be expensive, it could be difficult to get an appointment, even before COVID, but that's the person you call my doctor.
Yeah.
And if anything's ever wrong, you try to go see your doctor first before looking for a specialist, and you go to that person for years and years, and maybe it's multi-generational depending on the ages, but it could be someone that your parents went to, but it's still your doctor. That doesn't seem to be the case here in Taiwan, because people just walk into the nearest hospital or doctor's office.
So it resulted in a lot of abuse.
How so?
Yeah, because actually you can bypass family doctors to see any to see whatever specialty you want to see, right? And then so because the national insurance system, that the resource is limited, and so it ends up in different specialities compete for the same resource, right?
You mean you could go to any number of different doctors for the same thing?
Well, technically,
I'm talking about a basic, a small problem. Obviously not talking about major surgery here.
Right.
But I'm talking about an ache or a kind of an ache or a pain or something like that.
Yeah, if you go to these clinics on the street, these small hospitals in the street, yes, of course. Yeah.
Well, why doesn't Taiwan sort of develop the model where you would have the family your doctor that you would consider the first person you go to for years and years and years?
Well, I guess in Taiwan, I don't know how many years ago the government did have the vision to develop this kind of system, but I don't know why it didn't happen. Right?
I remember, when I asked my Taiwan friends, I'm not feeling well, I said, well, are you going to go to your doctor? And they look at me like I'm crazy. They go, what are you talking about? What do you mean my doctor? I'll just walk into the closest closest one. And of course, from a foreign perspective, we always find it unusual that hospitals in Taiwan play the role of first-line treatment.
The lucky thing is that all these specialized doctors, they all receive quite adequate primary care training. So, well, I guess in Taiwan you don't face too many problems by doing that.
Dr. Wu, we're almost out of time. So, could you tell us where could people find out more about you? Where could they buy your book, for example?
All right. Okay. So if you want to buy my book, I guess now, well, you go to the website of MIT Press, and I guess there are some publishers in Taiwan trying to get on hold to the copyright to publish my Chinese translation, and so I don't know when it's going to be published because they need to find a translator first, right? And if you want to know more about what I'm doing, go to my personal website. Yeah, it's www.harry.yj-wu.com. Right.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Wu. I've loved our conversation, and I learned so much about the history of medicine, and especially here in Taiwan. Have a great weekend.
Thank you, Ross. Thank you for inviting me.
You've been listening to Residence Messenger on Taipei Broadcasting Station.